Deep in the woods, there was a small cabin that belonged to a mysterious man whom nobody knew. The townsfolk had always been curious about him, but nobody had ever seen him before. One day, a group of kids wandered off into the woods and stumbled upon the cabin. They were curious and decided to take a peek inside. As they peered through the window, they noticed that the cabin was eerily empty. There were no signs of life, and the furniture looked old and abandoned. Suddenly, they heard a rustling outside, and they quickly hid behind a nearby tree. They peeked out and saw a figure walking towards the cabin. The children huddled together, watching the figure approach the cabin with trepidation. It was a tall and lanky man, with a wild mane of hair that looked like it had never seen a comb. His clothes were ragged and torn, and he carried a large sack over his shoulder. The children couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as he neared the cabin. As the man reached the door, he paused for a moment, as if listening for something. The children held their breath, afraid to make a sound. Suddenly, the man turned and looked straight at them. They gasped and quickly ducked behind the tree again, hoping that he hadn't seen them. For a moment, the woods were silent, save for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The children dared not move, afraid that the man would come looking for them. But after what seemed like an eternity, they heard the sound of the door creaking open, followed by the soft padding of footsteps inside the cabin. The children exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do next. They knew they should run back to town and tell their parents what they had seen, but the sense of curiosity was too strong to ignore. They decided to stay and wait a little longer, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious man. Minutes passed, and there was still no sign of the man leaving the cabin. The children were growing restless, and their stomachs were starting to grumble. Just as they were about to give up and head back to town, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from inside the cabin. They froze, unsure of what to do. The scream was followed by a loud thud, and then silence. The children looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear. They knew that they had to leave and tell someone what had happened, but they were too scared to move. Finally, one of the children summoned the courage to peek around the tree again. The cabin door was still open, and there was no sign of the man or whoever had screamed. The children took one last look at the cabin and then ran back to town as fast as they could, their hearts racing with fear and excitement. The children burst into town, panting and out of breath. They ran straight to the sheriff's office and pounded on the door until the sheriff opened it. They told him everything they had seen and heard in the woods, from the mysterious cabin to the blood-curdling scream. The sheriff listened to the children's story with a frown, his face twisting in concern as they described the events that had unfolded in the woods. He asked them to take a seat and poured them each a glass of water, trying to calm their nerves. "Are you sure about what you saw?" he asked, his eyes searching their faces. The children nodded vigorously. "Yes, we're sure. We saw the cabin, and then we saw the man, and then we heard the scream," one of them said, their voice trembling. The sheriff sighed, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew that he had to investigate this right away, but he couldn't do it alone. He gathered a group of his most trusted deputies and headed out to the woods to check out the cabin. When they arrived, the sheriff and his deputies were immediately struck by the eerie silence of the woods. The leaves rustled in the wind, but there were no birds chirping or animals scurrying about. The cabin stood before them, silent and foreboding. The sheriff cautiously approached the cabin, his hand on his gun. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, scanning the room for any signs of life. The cabin was dark and musty, and there was a strange odor in the air. As the sheriff stepped inside the cabin, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, making it difficult to breathe. He switched on his flashlight and scanned the room, looking for any signs of life. The first thing he noticed was that the cabin was sparsely furnished. There was an old wooden table in the center of the room, a few chairs scattered around it, and a small fireplace in one corner. The walls were bare, and there were no personal belongings or decorations of any kind. As he moved further into the room, he noticed the source of the strange odor. There was a pile of rotting food in one corner of the room, attracting flies and other insects. The stench was overwhelming, and he had to cover his nose and mouth to avoid gagging. The sheriff's eyes were drawn to a small wooden cabinet in the corner of the room. He cautiously approached it, his hand still on his gun. He opened the cabinet door, half expecting to find something sinister inside, but it was empty. Suddenly, he heard a noise from outside, and he quickly turned off his flashlight, trying to stay hidden in the darkness. He strained his ears, listening for any sounds of movement, but all he could hear was the rustling of leaves in the wind. He waited for a few minutes, but there was no further sound. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. Slowly, he turned his flashlight back on and continued his search of the cabin. As he moved through the room, he felt a creeping sense of unease settling over him. It was almost as if the cabin itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a wrong move. He knew that he had to be careful, that he couldn't let his guard down for even a moment. Finally, after what felt like hours, he and his deputies finished their search of the cabin. They found nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of life or activity. The only thing that remained was the strange sense of foreboding that hung over the cabin like a dark cloud. The sheriff and his deputies left the cabin, still feeling uneasy about what they had just experienced. They returned to the town and began to investigate the disappearance of the townsfolk who had gone missing in the woods. They questioned the families and friends of the missing individuals, but nobody had any leads or information that could help them. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. The townsfolk began to lose hope of ever finding their missing loved ones, and a sense of fear and unease settled over the town. One night, the sheriff received a call from a frantic woman who lived on the outskirts of town. She claimed that she had seen a shadowy figure lurking in the woods near her home, and that she feared for her safety. The sheriff knew that he had to act quickly, before anyone else went missing. He gathered his deputies and headed out to the woman's home, determined to catch whoever or whatever was responsible for the disappearances. As they entered the woods, they could feel the tension in the air. The woods were silent, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. The sheriff's flashlight beam flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows on the trees. Suddenly, they heard a sound. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the darkness. The sheriff and his deputies drew their weapons, ready for whatever lay ahead. As they moved deeper into the woods, the growling grew louder. They could hear something moving in the underbrush, something big and powerful. The sheriff's heart was pounding in his chest, but he knew that he couldn't show any fear. He had to be strong for his deputies, and for the townsfolk who were depending on him. Finally, they reached a small clearing in the woods. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, tall and imposing. It was the mysterious man from the cabin, and he was holding a large, bloodied knife. The sheriff and his deputies didn't hesitate. They raised their weapons and demanded that the man drop the knife and surrender. But he just stood there, staring at them with dark, unblinking eyes. Suddenly, he lunged forward, the knife glinting in the moonlight. The sheriff and his deputies fired their weapons, and the man fell to the ground. As they approached the fallen figure, they realized with horror that he was not a man at all. He was something else, something otherworldly and terrifying. His skin was blackened and charred, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. The sheriff and his deputies knew then that they had stumbled upon something that defied explanation. They didn't know what the creature was, or where it had come from, but they knew that they had to do whatever it took to keep the town safe from its malevolent influence.